boomers turn 65, and by the year 2030, the Administration on Aging estimates the number of Americans entering retirement age will double. Demographics alone, without even mentioning the politics or economics, are just one reason why public resources will continue to feel the pressure of a tighter belt. On a policy front, science and evidence will be absolutely critical to the future of occupational therapy on our centennial vision journey. And I'm not simply speculating about the two-pronged value of attitude with evidence. Here's a concrete case. Last December, the North Dakota Occupational Therapy Association notified the AOTA policy team that Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Dakota was accepting public comments on its draft medical policy for sensory integration therapy. Are you here in North Dakota, guys? Okay. Insurance providers develop medical policies like these to serve as guidelines for coverage and reimbursement decisions. To our shock, Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Dakota reached the conclusion that, and I quote, sensory integration is considered investigational. However, AOTA realized the conclusion was based upon incomplete and outdated information. AOTA had to act, and it had to act fast. At stake was the future of North Dakotans' access to SI services as a function of insurance coverage. We were disappointed that the draft medical policy did not include significant research findings regarding occupational therapy and sensory integration, and we said so. We offered examples of current scientific evidence demonstrating SI's effectiveness, such as the randomized controlled trials conducted by Beth Pfeiffer, Christy Koenig, Moyer Keneally, Megan Shepard, and Lori Henderson, and by Yazim Fazioglu and Gulen Baran. We urge dialogue between the North Dakota Occupational Therapy Association, AOTA, and our global community of experts. Practitioners in North Dakota submitted case scenarios to Blue Cross Blue Shield that reflected the evidence provided by AOTA. Parents provided invaluable examples of functional improvements resulting from the therapy that their children received. And guess what? After a bit of back and forth, Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Dakota decided to put their medical policy decision on indefinite hold. You've clapped, but I'm going to say bravo to Sarah Nelson and members of the North Dakota Occupational Therapy Association's Legislation and Practice Committee for a hard-fought victory. Woohoo! Even though the battle is not yet over, the North Dakota case is a picture-perfect example of how together attitude with evidence are critical to realizing the centennial vision. Attitude. The North Dakota Occupational Therapy Association went on high alert, knowing consumer access was on the line. AOTA took a cordial but firm tack and pursued negotiations with a sense of confidence, power, and justice. Evidence. We accessed our best research studies, marshaled our experts on insurance policy and sensory integration, and stood tall upon the foundation of scientific credibility and substance. Look at what we can achieve by using attitude with evidence. This past year, the linkage between evidence, policy, and clinical care was dramatically visible in other ways. As states have begun to implement insurance exchanges, AOTA has used research on maintenance and habilitation to shape our advocacy efforts so that patients enrolled in these new organizations will receive these critical components of comprehensive care. During a call for public comment on the autism best practice guidelines that was being drafted by the California Department of Developmental Services, AOTA forwarded evidence on the effectiveness of sensory integration therapy to ensure it received due consideration. By leveraging evidence of occupational therapy's effectiveness, we also successfully advocated for fair payment for OT services, extending the therapy cap exceptions process and reversing the payment reduction under the fee schedule. Armed with evidence of our role in the public primary education system, AOTA worked to protect the primary role for occupational therapy as an early intervention service under the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. But the value of OT in HD 3D is not limited only to policy and politics. Attitude with evidence can propel researchers, educators, and clinicians forward. Susan Murphy provides an outstanding example of a way to bring OT in HD 3D to life. Dr. Murphy, a research health science specialist and occupational therapist, leads the PORT program at the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System in Michigan. PORT is the acronym for Practice-Oriented Research Training, and through it, clinicians receive mentoring and training in research fundamentals and learn the steps to developing their own clinical trials. In the next phase of our journey, let's continue to find innovative ways, as does the PORT program, to narrow the gap between research and practice. Now I want to take a moment to talk to our seasoned veterans who, like me, remember a time before all the fuss about evidence. I want to qualify the role that science and evidence plays in our critical practice today. Don't misunderstand. I am not suggesting that everybody must be conducting clinical trials or publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals. But what I am saying is that we must absolutely not be intimidated by the idea of research and evidence. We must not cower when other professions appeal to their own evidence in an attempt to undermine occupational therapy. We must not assume that only randomized controlled trials and meta-reviews render a specific practice area scientific. We must realize that across disciplines, the criteria to establish an intervention as evidence-based is being fiercely debated. For example, in one set of national reviews on autism intervention effectiveness, 5 single subject design studies are considered adequate. But in another, such studies are deemed not sufficiently rigorous to even warrant inclusion in the review. And medical directors of insurance companies are skeptical that the findings of even the most tightly controlled research RCT can be reproduced in their settings with their practitioners and with their clients. What is being realized is that when it comes to research methodology and the criteria for what counts as evidence-based, one size does not fit all. Go ahead. Interventions must be individually tailored to and adapted for local context. Evidence is not a goal unto itself. Rather, blending evidence into your practice should feel more like a continuous process that ultimately enhances the quality of your outcomes in your local situation. OT in HD 3D is about attitude with evidence. But as a corollary, let's have the right attitude about evidence as our journey moves forward. What counts most is that you demonstrate at a local level that what you do works with your patients in your setting. Go for it. Let's also be candid about the way evidence-based practice is idealized in much of the literature versus its actual application in real-world settings. Social scientists John Gabay and Andre Lemay studied the way expert primary care physicians used evidence in their everyday practices, in the trenches, so to speak. They found, not surprisingly, that practitioners account for many different factors when making clinical decisions and play multiple roles beyond provision of treatment per se. For example, when they're consoling a bereaved patient. They discovered that evidence, that is evidence in its narrowest definition of peer-reviewed academic sources, played a really small part in most care decisions. Even in circumstances when the evidence was readily available. It turns out that the bulk of clinical decisions are set against real-life backdrops that are complex, subjective, intuitive, and even conflicting. Think of the way, for example, financial circumstances complicate best practice that otherwise seem very cut and dry. Many of you know that I'm doing research now in the area of spinal cord injury, and the best beds, some of the best equipment is just not affordable for many clients. That's just my real life example right now. These researchers recognize that practitioners operate according to what they call mind lines, defined as clinicians' internalized and often tacit guidelines informed by training, by their own and each other's experiences, by their understanding of local circumstances, resources, and systems, and by a host of other sources. Mind lines are only partially woven from textbooks and academic journals, media, colleagues, industry reps, patient views, opinion leaders, and our experience also informs clinical practice. Unlike research that cannot logistically account for every possible set of clinical circumstances, mind lines are malleable and responsive enough to guide practitioners through real-world contingencies. We all know that tacit reasoning impacts the quality of our care just as much as external evidence does, even if it does not always receive equal time and attention. We know evidence doesn't exist in a vacuum. We know clinical decisions are not made using a step-by-step checklist, but instead flow from the confluence of mind lines, context, and client. And now we know that we must develop a mind line dedicated specifically to the relevant scientific evidence. Being fluent in the evidence must be part and part of our professional identity. And while not everyone will do the science, we all must have a working knowledge of the most important evidence-based studies in our respective areas of practice. Whatever.